It is this case again. We briefly covered it yesterday about how well there was a lot of bad things associated with it. So we're going to not cover those again. What is interesting coming out of this is the fact that they're now given federal charges against him, against the okay, we'll go with alleged perpetrator, but everyone's almost certain with what happened. So because they're now pursuing federal charges, or they've levied federal charges against him, it opens the path to the death penalty and also removes him from um, the revolving door system that he'd been exposed to with what 14 priors, yet constantly being released back onto the streets. There was, I don't think this article says it. No. Yes. No. Okay, so he was. Yes. Okay. This one here. Okay, so he also suffered an arrest for repeating. Well, was in cut. Well, arrested. Not suffered an arrest. Means two things if you're in a hospital. Uh, calling 911, claiming people were trying to control him. Well, they were trying to medicate him. But there was also an unsourced report I saw this morning that was talking about the possibility he'd been trying to, I guess, get help in a way, calling 911. It was clear from this report that the alleged calls he was making and the content of them was that, yep, he knew there was a problem. There was a problem, so, a psychological, psychiatric problem, and he needed help. Now, some people point to Reagan's shutting down of the mental health asylums as being the start of a lot of this problem. And there's a common refrain out there: bring asylums back. Some people turn MAGA around to make asylums great again. There were a lot of abuses in the old asylum system. And I mean, Bedlam, Bethlehem Hospital in London, where Bedlam comes from, was horrific back in the day. It was one of the first psychiatric hospitals as such. A little more than a prison, really. And it seemed that the whole mental health asylum approach in subsequent years never really got better. There was a lot of effort and a lot of people trying, but dealing with the mentally unwell, particularly when it's a long-term mental health problem or psychiatric problem, can be very, very confronting. It's very, very difficult to ensure their safety and the safety of the people who are looking after them. And the line between therapy and abuse looked awfully thin at times. I mean, even the idea of ECT at the moment, electroconvulsive therapy, where they put electrodes on the side of their head, give you something to chew down on. Generally, I think they do twilight sedation now, but basically zap you to try and fix the uh, signals in your brain. Apparently, it's very effective, probably because people don't want to go back and get zapped again. But that's a procedure that's still in use that appears horribly barbaric to anybody outside of the system. And I'm sure as we go forward in time, there's probably going to be, it's probably going to eventually be retired and looked upon as barbaric and horrific, just like frontal lobotomies. Now, there are people out there with prone to seizures and things like that. I'm just trying to think of what the name of the illness is called. Prone to seizures who do have implants that provide low-level shocks directly to the brain, effectively. That for whom that sort of stuff works wonderfully. It's great for stopping certain seizures. Apparently, it's very effective with treatment-resistant depression and a few other things as well. But we're still looking at it as effectively something that appears very, very barbaric. I mean, as it is, even psychotherapy is still relatively new. Um, I mean, Freud wasn't that long ago, and even then, a lot of what he proposed and put forward has been dismissed, overturned, but apparently some of it's coming back into vogue. But yeah, anyway, the failures of the mental health system. Plenty of books out there on it. But is the solution to bring back asylums? Well, it's obviously too late in this case, but uh, would would a mental health response have saved things, changed things? I don't know. Maybe he would have only been in there on a 72-hour hold. Maybe he wouldn't have been able to get a long-term bed or the other support infrastructure he needed. Maybe it was all available to him and he refused to access or denied consent or things like that, and there was no one in his orbit or who had responsibility for him who was able to or willing to take the step to have him committed against his will, that sort of thing. Those sort of aspects are important to find out, but they don't change the outcome of what happened. They don't absolve him of the responsibility of what he did. The other issue, too, I mean, the issue that everyone's looking at is the fact that he was a frequent flyer in the system. That, yeah, 14 prior arrests and still on the streets. Yeah, I mean, sadly, it escalated to somebody losing their life in a very brutal and seemingly arbitrary manner. Yeah. So it almost seems like, okay, well, the state has now decided to charge him with first degree murder. And this comes down to the whole idea of judicial systems and how the judicial system seems to go soft gloves on people, whether it's an overreaction to perceived injustice that had been handed out in the past, that people were incarcerated unnecessarily, and then also the whole idea of like better to let the one guilty, well, better let the guilty walk free than to hang the innocent. Um, Quite obviously, the balance isn't there. It's one of those things where people generally see the failures, not the successes, and the failures can be very, very, very confronting when they are. And yeah, I mean, the attempt to rehabilitate, we've obviously moved on from the panopticon approach, which was considered very progressive for its time. I think people look at, say, the Scandinavian system and regard it as maybe being too soft. Now, uh, that's the one that, say, Anders Breivik is a long-term resident of. And people look at what he did and then look at the conditions he's living in while incarcerated and say, well, that's a fairly high standard of living. I mean, you don't deny someone their humanity once you lock them up. And so there's obviously a push for some sort of balance between letting them go constantly and locking them up forever. And the idea of incarceration should not be a replacement for treatment of the unwell. And it shouldn't get to the point that we're relying on the criminal justice system to take care of that. And, well, I think another part of the issue is like people getting focused in on um, per capita overrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain ethnic groups. If they're committing the crimes, they need to be pursued appropriately by the system. The reason why they're committing the crimes, if they're overrepresented, okay, yep, it's fair to ask, are they being unjustly targeted? Like, is there a policing response that is ignoring equivalent crimes in other communities to focus unfairly on one. Okay, that sort of stuff, we need to make sure that doesn't happen. But if they're being incarcerated and arrested on uh, an appropriate level based on the fact that they've committed the crime, well, the question then needs to be crime prevention. It needs to be a look at why there are more crimes being committed by those sections of the community, as opposed to just crying that it's police brutality and provocation. I mean, they've said that one of the things that killed the BLM movement faster than anything else was the widespread rollout of police body cams. Now, police body cams, I think, are a fantastic thing. I mean, I'm sure some of the police don't like it, having looked over the shoulder their entire thing shift, but it's certainly diffused situations far faster now that the evidence is there of what took place, rather than people standing over a dead body or a severely injured individual and it becoming a he said, she said, or he said, they said situation. And so, um, it helps avoid those sort of situations. Even maybe the George Floyd, even Breonna Taylor, Brown, just trying to think what the guy's first name. I mean, even that had a sad follow-up recently where one of the people who was involved peripherally with it, who basically came up with the whole hands up, don't shoot thing, himself died by gun violence. And it wasn't I don't think it was due to police. I think it was due to, well, he was shot by someone else in the community. And it's like, well, clearly there wasn't a lot of the change that people were pushing for or pretended they were pushing for never really made it there. Or maybe the claims that there were deeper problems that needed addressing that weren't going to be addressed by a couple of marches and waving placards needed to happen. Anyway, the sad thing is obviously the case here. But the big thing I took out of this article was the concurrent federal um, case against him. So, whilst it says that North Carolina does have the death penalty, though they haven't carried it out in 20 odd years, then the federal charges might also lead to that as well. Now, that would then be a very interesting argument once he reaches, assuming he goes through the court system and ends up on death row, federally and state level, which system would take precedence? That if he was able to appeal his state level death row sentence or death sentence and it was appealed or held up or anything like that, would the federal charges still, or would the federal system then still be able to take him and execute him in that regard? Or would it be that all process have to be put on hold whilst one is appealed? I don't know that I've heard of any case where that potentially applied, where they had death sentences at different levels being levied. I think that'll be worth keeping an eye on. It'll probably take a year or so, or a couple of years for this to come to a conclusion. It is still, I mean, sad for everything, but it's still a blight that it took this long for really any news about it to come out or any sort of activity or action to come out of it. I also think that if there were people involved in his previous exposure to the justice system, took, well, not mercy, gave them undue leniency, then they should also face consequences. obviously being appointed to a magistrate's or a judge position, there is obviously the expectation you're going to deal with some thorny issues, some issues on which there may be no one good answer or any good answer, but there should also be consequential outcomes for persistent um, leniency where it should not be applied. And I don't think stripping them of their registration at the bar is necessarily the right outcome. There probably needs to be um, potentially even incarceration. I mean, everyone else has to face the consequence of their actions at some point. Yeah. So, yeah. And apparently, while the mayor's also come under criticism as well, apparently the mayor is up for re-election at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see whether there is a groundswell to remove her, I think, and see what comes out of that.